Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full PreFrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function. I'm your host, Sucheta Kamath, and we keep these conversations about executive function fresh and to the point, and most importantly, relevant to your everyday application. One of the topics that interests me deeply is communication. As you all know, I'm a speech and language pathologist. I've specialized in impaired communication, but to me, communication, whether it's verbal communication, nonverbal communication, interpersonal, and written communication, I'm very, very interested in. And the second topic that's dear to my heart is parenting children and how to raise self-reliant children. So what comes to mind is raising children is really hard, not because of the work that goes into changing diapers or preparing meals or taking children to soccer or piano or even the whole load of laundry that you have to do. But parenting is hard because some people are not good with little people. They find it very intimidating to talk to children or to instruct them or raise them or with kind of boundaries and instructions and support. Sometimes parents tend to get very permissive, very accommodating. Sometimes they get very authoritative. Sometimes they just don't know how to yield cooperation. So with that in mind, I have been so fortunate to discover the expertise of our guest today. So it's a great privilege and honor to introduce today's guest. Since receiving a clinical psychology Ph.D. from State University of New York at Stony Brook in New York in 1975, Dr. Arthur Robin has a sprawling career of 47 years, which has included clinical practice, teaching, 37 years as a pediatric psychologist at Children's Hospital in Michigan and Wayne State University School of Medicine Research and Writing, specializing in parent-teen relationships, ADHD in adolescent and adults, and eating disorders in adolescents. He has authored and co-authored 5 books, many chapters and journal articles, and spoken often throughout the United States and elsewhere on this topic. One of the topics that interests me deeply is his approach to conflict resolution and building coalitions and teaching parents effective strategies to manage children who may be dysregulated, such as ADHD. So it's a great pleasure to have you on the show today, Arthur. How are you?
Very good, thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to be on your show. Thank you very much.
Well, the audience is really up for a treat because of your expertise in particularly the practical advice you're going to share. But before I begin, I thought I would ask this question, and you as a clinical psychologist with deep knowledge of executive function will be very comfortable answering. This podcast is about executive function, which entails this, goal-directed persistence, adaptive flexibility, managing focus and emotions, and above all, really exhibiting this problem-solving attitude. So you as a child, when you were a teenager, now what kind of child or a teenager were you? And what was your self-awareness like and your self-management skills were like at that age?
Well, I think as a child and teenager, I had pretty good executive functions, but I think what I struggled with would have been the self-restraint, trying to control the impulse to not do things like interrupt others or speak when I needed to be quiet or wait long enough, be patient. So I needed to, and that I struggled with as a child, I still struggle with as an adult because there's consistency across the lifespan with executive functions and those who struggle with. So, as a child and teenager, I also struggled a little bit with working memory. It took a long time to memorize things. I had to learn a variety of strategies to do that. So, self restraint and working memory would be two executive functions that, as an adult, child, and adolescent, I recall struggling with. And those struggles did stay with me across the lifespan.
That's so interesting. As I'm listening to you, I also I'm reminded of my executive function strengths and challenges. I always had phenomenal organization, incredible goal-directed persistence, putting effort and relentless effort if needed. But I do remember myself being impatient, interruptive,
Hmm.
and add Indian culture to the mix, and everybody interrupts everybody, so my interruption wouldn't stand out so much.
Hmm.
But I think when I came to from India to US, definitely I looked way interruptive than most people in conversation, particularly,
Hmm.
and very eager to kind of already think about what people are thinking and kind
Hmm.
of second guess and move forward. So, as we talk about our own abilities and skills, let's dive into your clinical expertise as a researcher and
Hmm.
as a practitioner. Can you set the tone for what is ADHD? And people sometimes refer to ADD. And often I
Hmm.
find one problematic presentation in medical community that pediatricians, for example, if they diagnose, they talk about the attention piece, but they never talk about executive function. So, can you share a little bit
Hmm.
with us the definition and its relationship to executive function?
Well, to start, the classic definition, which isn't sufficient anymore, would be that ADHD is a disorder of attention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. But that definition, again, doesn't really cover the waterfront or the concept. And so researchers and clinicians have come to a definition which goes something like this, that ADHD is a neurobiological disorder of
Hmm.
self regulation of the mind, of behavior, of emotions, and for some people, of activity level. And if a person is having trouble self regulating himself, this gets in the way of all aspects of life during childhood, adolescence, and it continues for a good 70 to 80% of individuals into adulthood. Now, where executive functions fit in is first we need a definition of executive functions. A broad based definition would be that executive functions are processes of the brain that guide all of our thoughts, feelings, and actions that are central to good self regulation. So, if ADHD represents a disorder of self regulation, and you used a few minutes ago the word dysregulation, children, adolescents, and adults who have ADHD, their behaviors, thoughts, emotions, and actions are often dysregulated. So, if executive functions are processes that guide all of our behaviors, feelings, and actions, then the executive functions are dysregulated or not working
Hmm.
efficiently or in an organized manner in ADHD. Now, a simple way to understand this is a metaphor that Dr. Tom Brown, who you've actually had on your
Yeah.
podcast, came up with. The metaphor of the conductor of an orchestra. And the conductor picks the musicians, selects the music, rehearses them, and then during the concert guides the musicians, guides them when to start, when to stop, which musicians and sections to play. And if he picked high quality musicians and guided them properly, the music sounds terrific. If not, it may not. So if you think of the brain's executive functions like the conductors of the orchestra, the brain conducts our day to day, moment to moment actions. And if the conductor isn't doing a good job or didn't pick quality musicians, then the music doesn't sound harmonious. And so in ADHD, it's as if the conductor, namely the executive functions, are not in synchrony, are not working well. And so the brain's music isn't coming
Mm.
out well, and or the specific components, like the musicians, aren't highly skilled or aren't playing correctly. So I often use Tom Brown's metaphor in talking about that. Um, um, I could talk about specific executive functions if you like, or we could pause. It depends what where, what you want to do next.
Oh, well, I would love to put a pin in here, and if I may comment so that you can proceed further, is one thing that I really love that you pointed out for all of us, that when you use regulation as a framework and not just attention deficit, I think it is hyper focus and under focus both can be taken into consideration, because this is a common
Hmm.
argument, right? That my child loves to play video games and I can't peel him off, or my child
Hmm.
loves to when she's doing a particular activity, I can't peel her off. But then
Hmm.
when it comes down to doing something that he or she doesn't like, we can't even get any attention, right? So that one
Right.
aspect you talked about regulation, but the second piece also I love is this emotional dysregulation, which is crying easily or having incredible fit of anger for a small trigger, and
Hmm.
then having
Hmm.
apathy or generally having meh feeling for something that you'd be
Hmm.
concerned about. So I was wondering if you
Hmm.
could maybe just talk a little bit about this. I like to call it as a Goldilocks effect, not being just right. So either you're too engaged or you're not engaged enough. You're too reactive and not calm, or hyper indifferent. So maybe you can talk a little bit about why such presentation comes, and how does that influence people's interactions with or children's or adolescents or adults interactions with those who don't have this dysregulation problem.
Well, I think part of what you're saying, and you could tell me if this is addressing it, is which executive functions are off base or on base.
Hmm.
I think the ADHD brain craves high stimulation. And so activities like video games, like texting, like like certain types of movies and music, they provide immediate and high stimulation. And so the ADHD brain that craves this kind of stimulation attaches to those very quickly and doesn't get satiated on them, and can do that for long periods of time. Other activities which don't provide high and immediate stimulation, like chores, like homework, like turning off the video games and coming to the dinner table,
Hmm.
like helping to clear out the basement or the garage, uh, those kinds of things don't provide that stimulation. And so the youngsters, as well as the adults with ADHD, I see this in the patients I work with across the lifespan, don't engage in those kinds of activities. And so the example you gave, which I was thinking of giving anyway, of mom telling Johnny or Sally, turn off the video games and come either do start your homework or come down for dinner. The high stimulation of the video games is compared to the low stimulation of coming down to dinner. The low stimulation activity of coming down to dinner is not going to compete with the high stimulation
Hmm.
of the video games, especially for the person with ADHD who craves stimulation. That's also true for people who don't have an ADHD type brain, but it's even more true for the person with ADHD. So I think what you're calling the Goldilocks effect has to do with different types of brains that crave uh, highly stimulating, immediately gratifying activities selecting those activities and being hooked on them and having a hard time breaking away for them. And that also gets to there are genetically based differences in how the brains are
Hmm.
for folks with challenges like ADHD, which make them more prone to getting stuck on such activities. So to
Amazing.
me, that's how I understand and how I explain that to parents.
Brilliant. I think it speaks to my heart. And now, if we can take a minute to connect executive function and communication. So, one of the biggest challenge which we started kicked off this episode with is interpersonal relationships. So, developmental disorders such as ADHD particularly has a significant impact in how you relate to people, and that parent child relationships, or yielding cooperation, or even
Mm,
expressing warmth and compassion, or responding to somebody's
mm,
requests. There may be a gap. I'll give you a quick story of
mm,
a family that I worked with. The father himself had ADHD. I think mother also had inattentive type ADHD, and they had this
mm,
firstborn with significant ADHD challenge. And a situation arose that it was a heavy pouring fall day in Atlanta, and the dad was driving the son to school. He was already late, so he was half dressed, shirt untucked, one shoe on, socks
mm,
on, and a bowl of yogurt with granola was in his lap, because the father said, "We are getting in the car and we are driving to school, and you can
mm,
eat in the car." And some conflict happened, and of course, dad pulled over and threw the kid, this 14-year-old, out of the car and told him to walk to school because he got so mad. So dad's impulsivity met with this teen's inappropriate comment, and instead of showing gratefulness to dad for driving and apologizing for causing delay. So this kind of headbutting is very common, at least in my practice, or the bane of a lot of families' existence. So I was wondering if we can start with what is the relationship between executive function challenge and its impact on interpersonal communication?
okay. Um, in any communication between parent and teen or any age child, like the interaction that you described, you have a speaker, and let's just stick with a dyad for simplicity, like the one you mentioned. You have a speaker and you have a listener. The speaker needs to send for good communication between a speaker and a listener. In your example, the speaker was a parent, dad, and the listener was a teen. The speaker needs to send a message that is clear and understandable, and the listener needs to be paying attention enough to get that message, needs to be able to decode and understand the message, and then they need to change roles so that then the listener becomes the speaker and sends a message back, and it's clear, and the new listener now can understand that. Okay. Now, uh, for each of those people to carry out their roles, they are, when carrying out their roles, they are using executive functions. They cannot, by definition, um, brain processes that guide all of our behavior, by definition, are guiding the behavior of the speaker and the listener. So, executive functions by definition, have to guide speakers and
Mm,
listeners in communication interchanges. So, any difficulties that either a parent or a child have, or any strengths that a parent or a child have, because we don't want to just focus on difficulties, we want to be strength based too. Strengths or difficulties, or degree of strengths or degree of difficulties that the parent and child have, including the dyad you mentioned, in executive functions will impact what happens when they communicate with each other. That's, for
hmm,
starters, how I see the relationship is. So, um, as a psychologist, when I do communication training, which is one of the cornerstones of behavioral family therapy that I do a lot with parents and teenagers. By definition, I am teaching executive functions every time I teach anything about communication training. So when the dad said, I don't know what his words were, get out of the car and walk, um, and you mentioned impulsive, he was showing weakness in
Y-
self-restraint.
yes.
Okay. He was showing perhaps weakness in working memory if he had memory about what are different parenting strategies that he could be using. He might have been showing weakness in getting organized, activated as to thinking of a parenting strategy. There were at least three or four executive functions that we may see as in possibly being in deficit at that moment, even if they're not in deficit in the long range. When the steps that led to the teen, it was a 14-year-old, the teen getting in the car, which you say, one sock, one shoe, and the
Yogurt and
bowl of
granola in
food,
a real bowl,
right? All those
unprepared,
steps
late.
that right, all those things, they're late, lost, and unprepared. One of my favorite books for parents.
Brilliant book.
Okay,
Yes.
um, all those things that led up to the teenager being that speak to the teenager's weakness in about in all of the six executive functions that are on Tom's Brown list. Dr. Tom Brown's list of core executive functions in deficit for people for ADHD played into that. And the fact that that teen had those weaknesses led to reciprocal negative reactions from his dad. So one person's weaknesses in executive function triggered in the communication interchange reciprocal reactions from the other person. So executive functions are intrinsic to any communication interaction. And since genetics are involved, even if the dad didn't have a clinical diagnosis, maybe this youngster did have a clinical
Yeah.
diagnosis of ADHD or something. The dad may not have. He might still have subclinical weaknesses in similar executive functions. So when one member of the family has a weakness in executive functions, others do too because of genetics. Again, even if the others don't have a clinical diagnosis. So it's impossible to avoid strengths and weaknesses degree of skill in executive functions when anybody is communicating with anybody else. So I see them as completely overlapping. And any intervention designed to change communication or any intervention designed to change executive functions, you change the one, you're changing the other unavoidably, even if you don't plan it that way. So, for many of the years of my career in the 70s and 80s, and even the early 90s, but certainly the 70s and 80s, I was not familiar with the executive function framework, but I was working with communication and problem solving. I didn't realize I was changing executive
Hmm.
functions, but I was because I was changing communication and problem solving between parents and teens.
You know,
That's a long answer to your
well,
question.
it's so on point, and I think I relate to it myself because when I started my career, 25, 30 years now, executive function was not even a term. We used right hemisphere dysfunction. But being a communication expert as a speech and language pathologist, understanding listener stance, understanding conversational repair, understanding how to read between the lines, those are the skills we taught people to have
Mhm,
effective relationships. Because even if you run into infractions because of inattention or lack of working memory or
mhm,
inflexibility, if you turn around and come back and say, I'm sorry, my bad, I was a little
mhm,
stubborn there or I was rigid there, people are likely to forgive you. But another thing that coexists with executive dysfunction that impacts communication. I was wondering, what are your thoughts about this lack of self awareness and lack of ability to understand the minds of others? So, kind of, what are other people thinking? What are they thinking about my thinking? How am I presenting to them? So, when you fail to think about or take those things into consideration, a lot of these communication problems intensify further. Um, I would love to hear your point of view on that.
Um, well, I agree with you, and I look at that as to a great extent, certainly well, to a great extent, that that is a teachable
Yes.
deficit that you can help parents and teenagers remediate that. Um, and and that may follow from chronic deficits in executive functions, particularly, well, first of all, if we take children and adolescents in particular, the developmental tasks of adolescents are very self-focused. Okay, so um, it's relatively common that adolescents are not as empathetic as people at other stages of life, like adulthood. So I find almost all the a lot of the adolescents I work with have a hard time understanding other people's point of view, but
True.
developmentally, as they
And don't
move,
you know some
yeah,
people who are stuck in that adolescent stage, even in the late adulthood,
that's true.
and they
Okay,
continue to be self-focused. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
yeah,
yeah.
but as they move into young adulthood and adulthood, many folks develop a much better sense of empathy and understanding of other people's point of view. And those who don't can be helped up to a point to learn that by life experiences. But there are also great individual differences in much, how well people are able to be empathetic and understand other people's differences. So I've looked at that, one, from the point of view of individual differences, two, assessing that clinically, and three, trying to help people increase their sense of empathy and understanding of where other people's points of view.
Hmm. So, I think this makes really good sense for us to now move on to the challenges, that are so they have even been accentuated in the contemporary climate, so to speak. There's a researcher who James Garbarino, who talks about social toxins. He talks about that the modern parents have to navigate a lot of complex challenges, including, the notion of parents having control over their children's lives by the information they choose to expose them to is also gone out of our hands now, simply by children having access to the internet, having
Mhm.
the more increased socioeconomic inequalities become very evident, which parents can protect the kids from in the silo that they may choose to live in. And also this very broad visual presentation of the line between childhood and adolescence and young adulthood is blurry, so that what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, that parents may have less sway than their peers and social media might. So I would love to know, from your point of view, how do you see these common problems of raising teens in these complex times?
It is much more difficult for parents today than 20, 30, 40 years ago to raise children. And I mean, what I see practically from these challenges is that parents have a lot less control over teens today. at a lot earlier age because, as you said, of all the factors that you mentioned. So parents need to form strong bonds of affection and strong relationships and keep them strong at an early age. And also, I teach parents with teenagers, if I'm lucky enough to be working with them when the youngsters are just moving into adolescence, but I
Hmm.
do this at any age in adolescence, a clear difference between negotiable and non-negotiable issues. Because with all the challenges you mentioned, teenagers have, as you well know, a huge sense of entitlement because society teaches that people can pick their own families today, that
Yes.
attitude. And and there's a sense of teens are entitled, ought to be entitled to anything and everything. And so they come to expect the world, and they're entitled to everything and anything. And they, because they see that that's an attitude in society, and so unless their parents have brought them up to have a different kind of attitude or approach, they expect that of their parents. And so parents really need at the outset of adolescence to have this clear distinction between what's negotiable and what's not negotiable so that they could hold on to what's not negotiable and be able to still impose their standards for morality and for appropriate conduct on those things that are non-negotiable. What do I mean by non-negotiable? For one, it should be a relatively short list, and it should be basic rules for living in a civilized family and society. The ones that we might think are obvious, but today are not so obvious. No violence at home, maybe only for self-defense would you use violence. No really nasty, bitter language at home, or perhaps not in society. No drugs or alcohol. Each family has to decide about things like smoking, hopefully no vaping, like although families might need to decide about that. Uh, do you like you will do your homework, although I teach families they could have pairs in negotiables and non-negotiables, that you will do your homeworks are non-negotiable. The conditions, when, where, can you listen to music and so on, those are negotiables. When they get old enough, having a curfew, but the conditions for curfew, when you could stay out later for a special event and so on, but having no more than 7 or 8 at most 10 non-negotiables. But again, if these aren't established by age 12 or 13, these days parents won't be able to establish them. And then I teach them to use whatever they can as consequences, both positive and negative, for breaching these. It's hard to do this if parents haven't been consistent when the children are younger.
Hmm.
If I'm working with the children who are younger, and their parents, and they've had difficulties, I'm teaching them to use discipline with love and behavior management
Hmm.
to manage that. Now, this side of what I've done in my career connects with co-authoring with Dr. Russell Barkley several books on defiant teens,
Yeah.
which is one of the things that I've done. But basically, helping parents make a distinction between negotiables and non-negotiables. This doesn't completely answer your question about the challenges that parents have. They have lots and lots of challenges, but this is part of, as a therapist, how I and some other psychologists have tried to set parents up at the outset of adolescence, because adolescence is the time that these challenges of modern society pose the greatest risk for families
I'll give you.
of their teenage for success. Um, and anyway, I'll just stop and pause here.
No, I think it's such a great point you're saying. I just love the simple framework of negotiable and non-negotiables. I often tell my parents, the parents that I work with, like my last name is Kamath, so these are Kamath rules. I don't have to explain to you how and why I came up with this, but this is the Kamath rule, and that's what we follow. This is the family ethos. This is who we are. This is what we do. Including one of my biggest pet peeves is when we travel. I always have asked my children to dress well. It's just something I grew up with. It's just you elevate the environment of travel, you get better treatment, and you also have put that effort prior to leaving for a long trip because anyway, it just takes more effort to be well prepared or looking well prepared. Um, I'll give you an example, and I would be very curious to see what your thought would be. So, of course, families begin to seek help when things get a little bit out of hand. And by then, I think a lot of rules become too annoying to the teen because they have not been raised with those teens. One family I worked with once, the mother came and said, I don't know what to do, Sucheta. My son shows up completely naked to the kitchen early in the morning. and so for that to happen at age 16, what was happening for last 16 years is the biggest question, right?
Right.
And so somewhere,
Right.
I mean, how to behave in public spaces, so not even having the distinction between public versus private space was that non-negotiable thing. So somewhere even at 14, something like that must have happened. So I'm just curious that people don't take small infractions seriously until they become big infractions. One of the stories in your book, you write about a child where the parents have disagreement about how to approach, but the child is jumping out of the window at night and hanging out with friends, bringing girls to his room during lunch hour, and then even gets in trouble with police because he gets pulled over. But the parents wake up to start thinking about what to do now after he gets pulled over by the cop. So it's an interesting phenomenon. What kind of threshold you recommend parents to have where kind of say, oh my goodness, I need to get a rein on this situation, rather than going too far and then compelled because now there's some legal ramifications and things like that.
So, what parents should do if they're in that situation at age 16 and the youngster's coming in the kitchen
Yeah, and no, I'm
nude
just saying,
and they're already
well,
there.
I'm saying people begin to reconsider their any strategic approach where there's no strategy only when things become really, really difficult. And by
Right.
then, to me, it's so late because the kids are gotten used to you not having any rules. And so I'm just saying
Right.
how, so there's one is crisis management, which is like reining things back in. But how
Right.
do you reestablish your authority over children who kind of start challenging you because you have never set any boundaries earlier on?
Um, you have to start with, you can't reestablish it all at
Yes.
once. So you have to start with one thing at a time. In a situation like that, I would be having the mom start probably actually modesty and clothing. Probably, I don't know that family situation, but it might be easier to deal with modesty and clothing than all the other things that teen might be doing. If that's what the mom is noticing, my guess is there's a whole bunch of more intense things that that teen is also doing, which
Touche.
will be much harder for the mom to reestablish authority over. So you have to start. I would have the family. Well, in case like that, I would be working a little bit with the mom and the teens separately before I work with the family
Mm.
together. The more dire the situation, the more likely I am as a therapist to work with parents and teens separately and concurrently before I put them together because I don't want explosions until I know what I'm dealing with. And I come up with a hierarchy from least to most provocative of the challenges that the teenager is giving to the family in terms of least to most provocative. And then I'd come up with trying to reestablish parental authority on the least provocative ones first, going up the hierarchy to the more provocative ones. And I'd come up with some uh, positives, see if I could come up with any positives, incentives that could be added, as well as things that need to be taken away. But I'd first have to come to understand how that came to be. And what I asked myself, this is when another component of behavioral family therapy comes into play, which we haven't mentioned, which is the strategic structural family therapy component. I need to understand what is the function of the problem behavior in the family system. So there's skills, communication skills, and problem solving skills. There's belief systems, extreme beliefs, and there's structure and function. When a 16-year-old shows up nude in the kitchen, I have to know or figure out what's the function of that behavior in the system, because it's a provocative behavior. And I can't simply ask what is the function of that behavior in the system. I figure out functions and family structure from meeting with family members together and apart over several meetings. Sometimes it takes more than several. If the function is to call attention to sexuality, that could be one function. Is the function to make some statement about some provocative statement? Once I know what the function is in the system, I then have to decide, am I going to change that function in the system, or am I going to find a less provocative way, less maladaptive way for that family to carry out that function? Okay.
Makes perfect sense.
It's and so examples of functions that might be going on, and I have no idea what they were in the system, oftentimes functions that with teenagers are the teenagers want more distance from their parents, and the parents are trying to keep more closeness to the teenagers, but the teenagers rebel or do outlandish things to put more distance between themselves and their parents. So there's an antagonistic function. Teenagers want to individuate, parents don't want to let them do that. And if I find that out to be the function, I try to find a more adaptive, less problematic way for them
Give
to
autonomy.
accomplish that function. Right. A second thing is in a two-parent family with one or more youngsters, often fixing a bad marriage, a teenager stuck in the middle and trying to keep the parents' bad marriage or bad relationship together is another common function I encounter. If I figure that out over time, then I need to figure out how to get the teenager out of the middle of the parents' marriage and get the parents their own help. And and that might be a number of different strategic moves that I would need to take as a family therapist. And they'll be different for each family. It won't simply be doing communication training. So that's a second possible function. There are other functions too. Sometimes the function is to the teenagers trying to call attention to this family stinks. We have problems, and we as a family need help. And that's the teenagers trying to make a statement by an outlandish behavior. And if that's the function, I need to help them publicly acknowledge to each other that the family has problems that go beyond the relationship between the teenager and the parents. So if stifling communication about this family has big problems is the function, I need to help them openly admit that to each other. So that's a long way of answering your question, which is I would have to get more information before I would assume it's simply a reflection of cultural norms, which it
Hmm.
could be, but I wouldn't jump to that conclusion until I understand whether or not there's a specific meaning or function for this family.
No, I really like that because I think it's almost like the psychologist lays their vision to see behind the flesh. You know, what's what is
Hmm.
the backbone of these collective behaviors, and what um, role they play in yielding either, asserting autonomy or
Hmm.
rebelling, so that you're pushing away the some forced way
Hmm.
of control that others are exerting. This makes really good sense to me. I was just wondering, one of the things that came to mind as you were speaking about this is, um, what if the parents themselves have ADHD and they themselves are inconsistent? And I see that very often. So part of the navigation that the child is trying to do is to deal with either the unpredictability that comes with inconsistency,
Hmm.
or lack of a sense of trust or a relaxation that comes from knowing things will be predictable, routine,
Hmm.
and reliable. So when you don't have in the house, that can create a little bit
Hmm.
chaos. So I would love for you to share your thoughts about that.
Okay. Well, in that case, as soon as I realize I may be dealing with a dual ADHD family, at least one adult and at least one child has ADHD. If the parents who has the ADHD is already diagnosed, then I move to step two of what I'm about to say. If I suspect it, but they're not yet diagnosed, I'll bring to their attention the possibility and see if they're open to getting diagnosed so we could have it on the table and deal with it. If they are, I would see if they will go through a diagnostic process, either with me or with someone else. Because once they are diagnosed, then if they're willing to be treated for their ADHD, the whole situation could improve
Hmm.
faster. Okay. So basically, have all the folks in the family who might have ADHD be diagnosed and be treated for ADHD is is the is step one, if possible.
Hmm.
Okay. Let's assume that happens. Okay. If it happens to turn out that one of the interventions that is being used is medication, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, then there's the possibility of the physicians you, prescribing medication for the parent and for the child can dose the medication optimally so that will part of the dosing of the medication will help improve family interaction between parents and child. An ideal situation is if it's the same physician, like a family doc who knows a little bit about ADHD or a lot about ADHD. So the family doc and I, with permission, stay in touch with
Hmm.
each other. So the family doc is dosing medication to the family interaction. Okay, so medication is optimized, and I'll just go on to other things in a moment. But this if you have this opportunity, it is a great opportunity when medication is appropriate and accepted by the parents in a dual ADHD diagnosis thing. So dose medication to the behaviors that need to change. One, consistency for parents in carrying out interventions and
Hmm.
parenting. And two, improving the behaviors the parents are trying to help the youngsters improve. So leaving the medication for a moment. I um, add to my intervention a component that's a cognitive behavioral type component for the parents on helping them learn to organizational strategies to be consistent in carrying out the interventions that I'm teaching them for improved family functioning. If this is a preteen, I am probably teaching them behavior management
Hmm.
interventions. If this is a teenager, I am probably teaching them communication skills and problem solving and things like that. And so then as I teach each skill, I do it more slowly. I do it in short, clear sentences. I may make sure that the non-ADHD spouse, if I have a two-parent couple, is not getting an undue burden such that the non-ADHD spouse would get burned out from the
Hmm.
parenting. I make sure that I'm sensitive, that it's evenly divided. I also make sure that with the couple that they have the parenting tasks divided so it's playing to their strengths, so that the ADHD spouse is not doing all the stuff that requires a huge amount of
Yeah.
paperwork, for example, and like if there's schlepping of kids to sports and so on, taking them all over the place, that's often I try to see if we get the ADHD spouse to be doing all of that. If there's checking over the details of homework to make sure it was done right, I try to work it out so that maybe the non-ADHD spouse is checking over all the details because the ADHD spouse is usually terrible at that. But the ADHD spouse still could be involved in supervising some things with homework, so all the homework doesn't get dumped on the
Hmm.
non-ADHD spouse. But I try to get the parenting tasks to play to their strengths. That the ADHD spouse can be the one putting the youngster to bed if it's a younger youngster and they have to do bedtime routines. But the non-ADHD spouse might be much better at some functions of homework. So try to optimize playing to their strengths, what they're going to do, and go from here. Does this make sense?
Oh, well, phenomenal. Yes. Thank you for like showing the three different paths here. Um, and, as we come to the end of this discussion, one thing that is so amazing about your insights is one, I think diagnosis is so important, and without that, and second, which is also part of the diagnosis, you need an expert. So sometimes I think instead of just relying on good faith effort, it might be great as a family to consult experts. Second thing is I love
Mm,
that this distinction between when to bring in medication versus medication plus, because a lot of families I
mm,
know are their first line of defense, and the only line of defense is medicine, but the medicine doesn't solve a lot of
mm,
interpersonal habit formation that has happened. But the
mm,
last thing that you really touched upon, which is this, there are certain distortions that we all carry, and those cognitive distortions require specific cognitive behavior approaches. And again, experts like a clinical psychologist such as yours is really very plays a very important role. So as we wrap this
mm.
conversation up, I would love to know if you have any recommendations for our audience regarding books that you have found influential. And we will be right. I have found your own book, which is ADHD in Adolescence, so one of the most influential books for me as a clinician. But wondering if you have two books to share before we wrap up.
Well, one I would recommend is by a school psychologist, Chris Dendy, and teenagers with ADD, ADHD, and executive function deficits, a guide for parents and professionals. Chris Dendy is really an expert on teenagers with ADD and how to teach them to improve their executive functions. And she has lots and lots of good advice. And she successfully raised several youngsters who are now grown up adults who work with her on her own work and presentations. So that would be one for sure that I would recommend. And the ADD and Adolescent book that you held up is a great book and is designed primarily for professionals. One that I collaborated on, which is designed for parents specifically, is Your Defiant Child. So I would recommend that one specifically for parents. Dr. Russ Barkley is the first author of that, and I'm the second. That one will help parents with a lot of the
Hmm.
strategies, even if their child isn't defiant, for a lot of parenting strategies, like the distinctions between negotiables and non-negotiables. I also want to add, just so parents would understand this, a lot of the examples that we talked about, it's not as simple as to do. The things that I said, that I do this or I do that, they're really not as simple as they might have sounded when we talked about them. It takes an awful lot of hard work. And when you look at the books, either Your Defiant Child or Christendi's book, there are lots and lots of illustrations about let you get the feel for how hard it is to make these changes. So I have a great deal of empathy for parents who are in those places, because I'm a parent of two youngsters who had different types of
I
ADHD
see.
as they grew up. So I know it's not as simple as we might have made it sound.
Definitely. Well, thank you for your expertise. And listeners, that's all the time we have today. Thank you again to Dr. Arthur Robin for being a guest. And as you see, these are very important conversations that we must continue to have to deepen our understanding of not just the nature of executive function, but the scope and manageability. One of the messages, I hope it struck a chord with you all, that these are malleable skills. That means they change with time and expert feedback and coaching. So definitely do not be afraid of executive function challenges. And lastly, if you love what you're listening, definitely keep spreading the word. Like us on our social media, join us in the movement, subscribe to our, our social media handles. And we look forward to seeing you again right here next time on Full Prefrontal. Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.